But tonight, we start our journey toward Christmas. Now, Christmas is problematic for us, isn't it? Let me give you a little secret about pastoral ministry. If you've been a pastor or in ministry for any time at all, Christmas, you love it, but you also kind of hate it because you have to find a new way to tell the Christmas story. The story that everybody knows like the back of their hand, whether they grew up in church or not. Because it's a story that we rehearse again and again every year, isn't it? A story of shepherds, and we know something about wise men, and little 8-pound, 6-ounce baby Jesus. He's in the story as well. But before we get into the story, none of you got my Will Ferrell reference. Or if you did, you were embarrassed to admit it. We got one or two out there got my little reference. That's sweet. So before we get into the story, actually, the problem is we rush in so quickly at Christmas time to tell the same old story that we forget to set the stage. We forget to remind ourselves that actually everything in Scripture that happens before Jesus, it's not just arbitrary, and it's not just superfluous. It's not just the older stuff that you can get rid of now that Jesus has come. Actually, everything in Scripture and everything in history that leads up to the moment that Jesus is born is fundamentally about that moment. It's about Jesus coming to us. And yet, usually when we tell the Christmas story, we start somewhere around the Virgin Mary learning that she's going to give birth. Or we start with poor, confused old Joseph who really doesn't know what's going on. Or with a couple trying to find space in an inn. Somewhere around there. The problem with that is not where Scripture starts the story. In the first gospel of the New Testament, in the very first verse, Matthew starts the story of Christmas like this. An account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Now that is a boring start to a story. Anyone who's spent any time reading books or watching movies knows that is not how you start an epic story. But actually, for some reason, Matthew, the gospel writer, feels like before we get into the good stuff, we have to lay all this groundwork. Maybe what Matthew's saying is actually that we won't understand this story without understanding what came before this story. That actually maybe we have to start with the prequels. Maybe we have to understand something about this great King David. Or maybe we have to understand something about this great father of faith, Abraham. And if we don't, then maybe we won't catch the gravity and depth and significance of what is going to happen here in Bethlehem to a small baby of a poor, poor family. I hate going to see Marvel movies with my wife, Emily. I'll go to see other movies with her. She usually chooses the chick flicks, and that's not just stereotyping. She just really... We watched the whole of Love Actually last night when I was supposed to be doing work. So anyway, I hate going to see Marvel movies with her for one specific reason. And it's because you can't watch a Marvel movie unless you've seen all the Marvel movies. I don't know if you realize that's just a money-making scheme that Marvel have come up with, which is quite genius. So I will sit next to Emily in the movie theater, and I can't really watch what Captain America's up to, because she'll constantly be saying, "Who's that guy? Who's that guy?" And I'll be like, "That's Iron Man." "Who's that one?" "Oh, that's Scarlet Witch." "Oh, he's very handsome. Who's that one?" "That's Thor." Just leave it. Just, gosh, calm down. That's really why I can't go to see it, because I can't stand the salivating over Chris Hemsworth. It's gross. Anyway, the problem with Marvel is that you cannot understand the stories unless you understand everything that came before these stories. And the problem is that you can't understand the story of Christmas unless you understand everything that set the stage for this man, Jesus, stepping into our midst. Last year at Staff Devotions on a Tuesday morning, which is what we do together as a staff team here at Westside, we talked a little bit about our prehistory. Your prehistory is all those events and all those people and stories and moments that came before you without which you wouldn't be here. I wonder how much time you've actually spent thinking about your prehistory. Let me tell you a little bit of mine. My mum and dad have been married 35 years. They met a couple of years before that. So let's say 37, 38 years ago they met. And this is how they met. My mum was in a rock band. Pretty good rock band. I'll actually give you the YouTube link to their records. I'm not even kidding around. She was the drummer. Okay, and that blood flows in my veins as well. Now, one day, that band decided that they needed a roadie. And so they called around, couldn't really find anybody. They found one guy. He just happened to own a van. His name was Chris Bedford, which is a real rock and roll name, isn't it? Like least rock and roll name ever. So he owned a van, and so he signed up to be the roadie. He turned up to meet the band, and as he was walking towards my mum to introduce himself for the first time, he tripped over the bass drum, and he sort of broke it a little bit, I guess, and he fell on the floor. And Mum said the fateful words, "That's a bass drum, by the way." And thus began a beautiful romance spanning the ages and spawning yours truly. But think about this for a second. What if my dad hadn't owned a van? What if he'd been not called by Mum's band and no one had heard about him? What if he hadn't turned up on that day if he'd been too busy? Or what if he hadn't fatefully tripped over my mum's bass drum? I might never have been. It's a scary thought, I know. Really worrying. See, in reality, all these events and moments and stories, no matter how trivial or unextraordinary, or on the other side, no matter how broken, no matter how tragic, no matter how unexpected, without them coming together, we would never really understand our own stories, would we? Maybe we can't understand who we are and what we are without understanding where we came from. So before we really jump in tonight, I want you guys to wrestle through this question for just 5 minutes. In what ways has where you've come from shaped who you are today? I'm going to give you guys 5 minutes around your tables to discuss that, and then we're going to be right back and jump back in to some of this around the story of Jesus at Christmas. So take 5 minutes. It seems that we can't really understand who we are without understanding a little bit about where we came from, can we? I don't know what you discussed around your tables. Maybe some of you picked up on specific stories or people or events or moments in your lives or before your lives. But whatever it is, without capturing those kind of moments and pieces in the bigger story of all those lives and events that came together to make us who we are, we can't really understand fundamentally who we are. Now, what does any of this have to do with Christmas? Well, it's interesting that the gospel writer starts the Christmas story not with Jesus, but way back with Abraham. Abraham is 2,000 years Jesus' senior. And so what Matthew's doing in the gospel is setting the stage. He's telling about the lives and the stories and the moments without which you cannot understand who this Jesus is and exactly the significance of what is happening here at Christmas. And yet what's interesting for us is that this is not exactly the prehistory that we expect. You see, when Matthew goes through his genealogy, everything that came before the Messiah, it isn't the trophy shelf of biblical heroes. It's not the kind of stock that you want the Messiah to come from. So you have to ask yourself, why include the kind of characters that you're going to see in this story? Why not blot out the unflattering bits? Why not cross over all the shameful and scandalous moments like we would so want to do with our own lives? And also, why not ignore all the unextraordinary bits? Why not just cross over all the banal, mundane, arbitrary stuff? The stuff that isn't the best and brightest that you want to talk about? Well, I wonder if it's because what the gospel writer is doing is not trying to prove Jesus' pedigree. The gospel writer isn't trying to prove that you should believe that Jesus is the Messiah because of where he came from. What he's trying to do is tell you the story that Jesus' whole life sought to tell you, which is the story of grace. That actually the story of God coming to us, the story of God redeeming the world through Christ, was born out of brokenness and born out of the mess and the dysfunction of the human story. And so if where we've come from shapes where we're going, then grace is a disruption to that story, isn't it? Grace is a disruption to the linear pattern that we base our lives around. Because grace means that there is nothing about where we've come from that can't be taken up and redeemed by being made part of the bigger story of God and his purposes in the world. And so out of a storyline that you could never project would produce anything lasting and pure and good and worthwhile, what happens? Jesus comes to us out of that kind of a story. Which is maybe why Matthew is launching his gospel with this very long, and let's just be honest with each other, because Matthew's not here, tedious genealogy of Jesus. To remind you and to remind me, here at the beginning of his story, that this is a story about grace. And that's what we want to walk through together tonight. So you'll find on your table here some handouts. Now, the handouts list this genealogy in all its banal, boring detail. And as we walk through this tonight, we're going to have you underline a few bits to help draw out exactly what is so scandalous about this prehistory of Jesus. So let's start right here at the beginning. On your handouts, you'll read it says this: an account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. So go back over that list, grab a pen, and underline Isaac. Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac was the father of Jacob. Underline Jacob. And Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. Underline Judah. See, these are the patriarchs of the Abrahamic faith. These are the biblical big guns, the forerunners of the promise of God to his people in the world. And so these are exactly the kind of names that we expect on the genealogy, aren't they? These are the kind of names we expect because they represent God's purposes in the world. And actually, though, if you know the story, then you really shouldn't expect these names. You see, if you know the stories behind these names we've just underlined, you'll know that before Isaac, there is another son. There's a son that comes first to Abraham. His name's Ishmael, and he's the firstborn. Now, in the ancient world, the firstborn is the one who reserves all the rights, all the privileges, that he is the one for whom the promise is supposed to pass through his blood, his line, and instead we get Isaac. And if you know the stories, you know that before Jacob, there's another brother. Now, they're twins, so I'm sort of plucking at straws here because he's like 2 minutes older, but he's still older, all right? His name is Esau. But not only is Esau the firstborn, he's also the righteous one. He's also the one for whom, if God is out looking for the most deserving person to fulfill his purposes, he goes to Esau. But instead, what name do we get? We get Jacob. Jacob, the deceptive, lying, cheating scoundrel who stole Esau's birthright. And then you get this final name that we underline, Judah and his brothers. Now, it's interesting that Matthew says, and his brothers, because almost everybody in this list has an awful lot of brothers, all right, in the Bible. It's not like, oh, I have one brother. It's like I have 40 brothers. It's ridiculous. So he says Judah and his brothers. Now, why is he telling you that? Well, it's because he's trying to remind you that one of those brothers' names you have definitely heard of, whether you've spent any time in church or not, because his name's Joseph. Joseph and his famous technicolored dream coat. Because Joseph is the one that Jacob loved, that his father cherished, that he wanted the promise to Abraham to pass through Joseph's seeds. But what happened? He was sold into slavery. By who? Judah. By Judah and his brothers. And so none of these righteous people, Ishmael and Esau and Joseph, make their name into the list. None of them get a mention in the story. Instead, we get Isaac the lesser. We get Jacob the cheater. We get Judah the bully. Instead of the righteous and the noble and the good, the prehistory of Jesus begins with the undeserving. If you've ever watched a movie or you've ever read a book, then you'll know that our cultural narratives and our defining myths in the Western world are based around the fundamental precept that the good guy wins. We can't really reconcile with the kind of story where the good guy doesn't come out on top. That becomes really problematic for us to experience. Because for all of us, we know fundamentally that you're supposed to get what you deserve. That's how the universe is supposed to work. And this is why we like movies and books so much, because they give a balance to the universe that often feels desperately unbalanced. That when we look around at life and history and the events around our world, it seems like the good guys never come out on top. So what do? We watch movies instead, where the good guy always wins, where it always goes to the most deserving person. Now, this is true of the ancient world as well. The epic myths in which Abraham's story came out, and even more, in which Matthew, in the time he was writing, came out, are myths about cultural heroes who represent nations, and they represent tribes, and they represent people groups, and they always win. Someone once said that history is written by the victors. And that's true, but it's more true to say that the victors just don't tell you about the bits of history in which they lose. Why? Because the point is that the good guys, the most deserving, always come out on top. But see, Israel told very different stories. Israel's defining myths were not about the most deserving winning the day. They were always about the least deserving. In Israel's myths, the trickster always wins, and the scoundrel, and the cheater, and the bully always seems to come out on top. Now that seems strange to us to read, but it only seems strange if you think this is a story about balance, about the good guys winning and the bad guys losing. But actually, what if the Bible is not a story about balance? What if it's a story about grace? In our Heretic series a couple of months ago, we used this quote of Martin Luther's, which I just love. The love of God does not find, but creates that which is pleasing to him. Which is to say that maybe God doesn't necessarily select the most noble. Maybe he doesn't select the purest person, the best and the brightest, the most deserving person to fulfill his purposes. Maybe God doesn't scour the earth looking for people to be his heroes and his heroines. Maybe God goes to the least deserving. Now, why is that important for us? And why is Matthew bothering to point it out right here at the beginning of his gospel? Because if you're a Jesus follower tonight, then this is the kind of story you are supposed to tell with your life. The kind of story that your life tells, whether you want it to or not, if you claim to walk with Jesus, is that it's not what you've done, but what God has done that counts. That it isn't who you are, but who God is that determines the story God is writing with your life. And yet everywhere we look, we see a different story being written, don't we? Everywhere we look, we're saturated with the story of self-improvement, the story of upward mobility, of becoming our best selves. And this has started to contaminate the church as well, particularly down south. You see books coming out titled things like Becoming a Better You. Now that's a really interesting way of saying, here's how to make yourself more deserving of the grace that you've received freely. That maybe you're sat there tonight and saying, I'm not smart enough to be used by God. Maybe I'm not educated enough, or influential enough, or creative, or compassionate, or insert adjective here. Maybe you're looking at other people in the room, and you spend most of your life looking at other people and saying that person deserves to be used by God. And yet the story of Jesus, the story that God is rewriting for all people everywhere, begins not with those best and brightest, but with the least deserving. That maybe it's actually not about you giving value to God's story, but becoming part of the story of God that gives you your value. So we start here with the undeserving. And then he quickly moves on. This is my favorite piece. He says, and Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. So underlined by Tamar. Now we're getting pretty shoulder deep in some Hebrew names here, so forgive me. And Perez the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Aram, Aram Aminadab, Aminadab Nahshon, Nahshon Salmon, Salmon, I guess that's an English word. Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab. Now underlined by Rahab. And Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, underlined by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, Jesse the father of King David, and David was the father of Solomon by the wife of Uriah, underline that piece. Now maybe those names I got you to underline don't seem weird to us, but for a first century reader of Matthew's gospel to whom it was written, they would be scandalized to see these names. Let me tell you why. There are certain names that you do not include in genealogies in the first century. Especially in genealogies that are supposed to convince you who the Messiah is. And those names are the names of women. You do not include the names of women in genealogies. That would be a scandalous thing to do. Call it whatever you want, that they were second-rate citizens in the ancient world. That's only partly true. But really, it's just historically a tradition that you don't mention the women. And yet Matthew decides not just to mention the women, but to mention a very specific kind of women. Think about this. There could be as many women as men on this list. I don't know if you understand how the birds and the bees works, but for every man's name, you could also include a woman's name, all right? But instead, we only get 4. First, he gives us Tamar. Now, Tamar was an outsider. She wasn't a Hebrew. So you're really not supposed to include her name, but it gets even worse. Tamar tricked her father-in-law Jacob into getting her pregnant so that she could have a baby and continue this lineage. Okay, and then you have Rahab. Now, Rahab also wasn't a Hebrew, but she actually was a prostitute. She didn't just pretend to be a prostitute to get her father-in-law to knock her up. She actually was a prostitute, so you're really not supposed to include that name. And then you have Ruth. Now, Ruth was a good person, but she still wasn't a Hebrew. She was an outsider. She didn't belong to this community. And then finally, that last name, most notoriously, the woman who doesn't even get a name in the list. Such is the scandal surrounding her story. She's just called the wife of Uriah. You probably know this story. Bathsheba, the victim of David's abuse of power. That David says, that girl's pretty attractive. I'd like to have babies with her. Sadly, she's married. So I'll send her husband off to the front line of the battlefield where he's guaranteed to get killed, and then I'll marry her. So why bother naming these women? You see, these are the bits that you're supposed to leave out of the story. If you're writing an autobiography, or if you've read anyone's autobiography, you know that these are the bits that you call a challenge, a hiccup in the story. I had a great life, and then there was a challenge. I won't really go into detail. A prostitute tricked me into having babies with her because I was her father-in-law, and then you carry on with the story. You're not supposed to include these bits. And yet Matthew not only includes them, but he shines a light on them. He chooses to name them. Why? Because Matthew's telling us that the scandal of the gospel is that in the story of God, the inflicted and the insulted and ignored and unregarded get included. So right next to those names, the unregarded. One of the things that most profoundly moves me about God, one of the things that makes Christianity unique among all the world religions, that in the sense that in Christianity, God chooses to reveal himself in the vulnerability of a human child, is that God gives voice to the voiceless. God gives a name to the unregarded, to the ignored and the beaten down and the victimized. To those, he gives a privileged position in the very story of God. I just got back from Romania from a couple of weeks, visiting some organizations around Eastern Europe with which Westside's looking to partner. And my favorite time was one day that I spent in Romania with a woman called Jana. Now, Jana was a psychologist in Australia. She was Romanian born, but she moved to Australia at a young age, became a very successful psychologist. And at some point in her life, about 10 years ago, God called her to go back to Romania and to give a voice to the most voiceless community she could think of, which is girls being trafficked into the sex industry. Romania is a major source country of trafficking, both for Europe, but also for Asia and then into North America too. And not many people in Romania are really doing anything about this issue. And so I got chatting to Jana and hearing a little bit of her story. Now, Jana runs a tiny, rinky-dink safe house operation. She currently has 6 or 7 girls in her care. A tiny organization trying to battle this enormous monster of a problem in Eastern Europe. Yet, as I'm talking to Jana and I'm aware how small this ministry is, I notice a dusty old photo frame just next to her. It's a picture of her shaking hands with the Pope. And so I said, Jana, sorry to interrupt. That is you with the Pope, right? She says, yeah, Pope Francis heard a little bit about what I'm doing and he asked to meet me. Okay, casual. She dropped into conversation later on that last year she'd been voted Reader's Digest European Person of the Year. Such is her influence in the continent of Europe. And I found myself looking around and saying, you take care of 6 girls who have been rescued from trafficking. By any standard, you are unregarded, unknown, anonymous. And yet, she has an influence that far outweighs her little life. How is it that that's possible? How is it that it comes to be that a little woman called Jana gives up her life in Australia as a successful psychologist and chooses to care for the voiceless? And somehow, she gets a purpose in her life that is infinitely larger than anything she could orchestrate. At some point, all of us know what it is to be ignored. At some point, all of us have felt that painful, crippling experience of being silenced, of being unregarded or pushed to the side. Well, the story of what God is doing in our lives often begins right there. It begins in these broken pieces. You see, Jana could have stayed in Australia. She could have stayed with her success and her influence, but the kind of success and influence that isn't about you, but about God's story in the world doesn't start there. It starts with embracing these broken pieces. It starts with inhabiting these moments that become landmarks and milestones in the story of what God is doing in our lives. And you find yourself named. The unregarded become known far beyond anything they could plan for themselves. Now, by the way, there's a 5th woman in the list. The 5th and final woman. Do you know who it is? Mary. Mary gets included in the list by name. Why? Not only because she's the mother of Jesus, but because in some sense she's like all of these women. She's unknown. She's unregarded. She has this unconventional pregnancy, and yet somehow she goes down in history as the mother of Jesus Christ. Now remember that Mary lived out the rest of her life with everybody around her thinking or knowing that she had cheated on Joseph before they were married. Remember that. It wasn't like they just believed that until Jesus was born, and then they were like, well, he's wearing a halo, so he's probably the Messiah, so everything's fine, everything's redeemed. She lived out her whole life as a nameless scandal in a backwater town of the Roman Empire. And yet in the story of God, she gets named. That's an incredibly beautiful thing. Tory.
Yeah, so as you're moving on, you read the genealogy. Sorry. And your mouth would drop at the wife of Uriah, right? But this is the part where you would probably throw the book because you would get so angry at some of the names that are mentioned. So we'll read it out loud here. And Solomon was the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam the father of Abijah, and Abijah the father of Asaph, and Asaph the father of Jehoshaphat, and Jehoshaphat the father of Joram, and Joram the father of Uzziah, and Uzziah the father of Jotham, and Jotham the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah the father of Manasseh, Manasseh the father of Amos, and Amos the father of Josiah, and Josiah the father of Jeconiah and his brothers at the time of the deportation of Babylon. So, these names, as a first century reader, especially a few of these names for sure, but we'll just go, if you want to underline Rehoboam. Now, Rehoboam was the son of Solomon. There was already some tension going on in the midst of Solomon, and at the end of his reign, he had started getting pretty big head and asserting himself. Solomon spent a lot of money. He was oppressing his people. And so Solomon died. Rehoboam was the successor. And the Israeli people came to Rehoboam and was like, hey, Rehoboam, your dad was pretty hard on us, and we were just wondering if maybe you can just let back a little bit. We'll treat you as king. We'll love you and respect you, but can you just give us a break on this work? So Rehoboam, of course, went to Solomon's old elders, and he talked with them and asked, well, should I do this for the Israelite people? And the wise old elders said, yeah, of course. Like, do this for the people. That's what they need. And it wasn't good enough for Rehoboam, so he went and talked with his equals, with his friends. He was like, hey friends, should I let up on these Israelite people? Should I give them a break? And his friends were like, no, you're the king, Rehoboam. You continue pressuring. You got to show them up. You got to show them you're even stronger than Solomon was. So Rehoboam, of course, listened to his friends and listened to kind of what he wanted to hear, right? So as that happened, clearly the Israelites did not like that, and this is where Israel and Judah split. This is where the whole civil war happened, was because of Rehoboam's mishandling of the rebellion in Israel. So that's, as a first century Jewish reader, seeing that name, you would hate that guy. It would be like, why is this guy in here? And you read on, and you see all these terrible, terrible kings. Absolutely horrendous. There were a couple good ones, but overall, the kings of Israel and Judah were not very good. And often, as you read First Kings and First and Second Chronicles, you see that a lot of them God did not favor. He was very angry at many of the kings. For example, Ahaz, you could underline there, he was into idol worship. He worshipped Baal. Manasseh, he was also into idol worship. They would sacrifice their own children to Baal for this, because they neglected the one true God, the God of Israel, which God specifically told them not to do. And because of this, because of all this happening, because of everything that went on, God allowed Babylon to come and take them over, and they were exiled. This worst part of the Israelite history had come to this point, and all these terrible, terrible kings. And this was just like so offensive to first century readers. And this just shows us, for the story of God, it will include the unjust. It will include in our stories the areas of darkness, the areas that we don't like to talk about, right? The stuff we would just like to shoo under the rug. We avoid the dark parts of our story, and we just try to lead back from them, right? We try to appear perfect, both individually and collectively, right? But here's the thing. God expects us to come to terms with our own sin. He does not want us to hide it. He does not want us to just minimize it, but he wants us to be fully open, 100%, in all truth, both the good, the bad, and the downright ugly. He wants the whole truth. So, practically speaking, what does this mean for us right now? How can we allow God to write in our stories? We need to confess some of the dark areas in our own lives. We need to realize we're not perfect and that there is some dark places we're still holding on and we haven't let God seen yet. We haven't confessed that to him. Because it's easy to confess the not so bad stuff, right? It's easy to confess like the little white lies, the sin that won't get us into too much trouble if people know about it. Yet God wants us to confess the sin that would really hurt our reputation to him. Sin that could give God a good reason to reject us. Sin that if someone actually knew what I did, if someone actually saw this side of me, they would totally reject me. There would be no need. They couldn't forgive me if they knew this side of me. But God wants us to confess those sins as well. Because here's the thing. God can and does redeem the worst parts of our stories. He absolutely will. And that's why we, as a collective and also individually, need to confess the dark parts of our history. So what have you been hiding from God that he may want you to receive forgiveness for?
Thanks, Tory. And so then after the unjust, this most scandalous of characters, the list draws to a close. But it draws to a really anticlimactic close. I'm not even going to bother reading it. One, because, let's face it, I can't pronounce any one name on that screen. But also because there's no names in this list that are worth underlining. This is the most anticlimactic ending to Jesus' genealogy. You see, we've been led up to this point by patriarchs, and then by scandals, which maybe we don't like, but at least it's exciting. And then by some tyrant kings, some crooks. And now you end up with these guys. Who are these guys? If you're reading this list and you think, I've never heard of any one of those names, don't feel bad. Because even if you get shoulder deep in Scripture, you won't find them anywhere. Which is precisely why these names are perhaps the most important ones for us in Jesus' prehistory. Because these are just the everyday guys. They're just the average Joes. They're just the little people with little lives in their little worlds, away from the spotlight, who have no idea that their stories are being caught up into the bigger story and purposes of God. Let's call them the unextraordinary. Now, I wonder if this is the most important group in the list for us for one reason. Because this is where we live most of our lives, isn't it? Most of our life isn't drama. Most of our life is not the broken moments. It isn't the bad decisions and regrets. Sometimes that can feel like the majority of our lives. But in reality, most of our life is groceries. Most of our life is suburbia. It's laundry and gas bills and remembering to pick up the milk on the way home. And it's important for us to remember these kind of unextraordinary characters, because if you've ever walked through dark moments, if you've ever walked through moments of pain and doubt and confusion, or as Tory said, maybe you've walked through moments of deep regret, then you know that it's hard to see God at work there. It's hard to see God at work in those kind of moments, but it is infinitely harder to see God at work in the everyday details. It's harder to see God at work in the unextraordinary stuff than it is in the painful stuff. Yesterday, I made a really bad decision myself. I went to Chinook on a Saturday just before Christmas. Don't know why I was thinking, don't pray for me, pure stupidity. And I sat there with the hustle and bustle going on all around me, and I found myself thinking, as I was thinking about this message today, I don't know any of these people's stories. I don't know their journeys. Maybe some of them are walking through really dark moments. Maybe some of them are walking through really good moments, but all of them are walking through unextraordinary moments because they are in Chinook on a Saturday just before Christmas. And it reminds me as I sit there that can I find God here? Can I find God in this kind of a moment? You see, if your God can't be found in some sense in the everyday and the ordinary and TV static and the bland banality of everyday life, then you need a wider vista. If your God is God of the quiet times, if your God turns up when you light that candle and heat up that hot chocolate in the morning over your devotional, but he doesn't turn up in the shopping mall hum and bustle of Chinook at Christmas time, then you need a bigger imagination of God. Because those dark moments and disruptive and shattering pieces of our lives, they might make up the decisive stuff. They might make up the definitive chapters of our lives. They might be the pieces that we talk about when we come to the end of our stories and look back. But most of the story, the bulk of the story, takes place in the in-between. Most of it takes place in the ordinary stuff. And it is in the in-between, ordinary stuff, that we find the arena for the story of God in our lives. You can't always see it. You can't always project it or predict it, but it's there. Grace is there, weaved into the story of the ebb and flow, not just of your Sunday night, but of your Monday morning, Wednesday afternoon life. And the promise, of course, as we come to the end of this list, as we close, and in fact, I'll invite our band up at this time to lead us in one last carol. The promise as we come to this list is that maybe it's not in who or where we are, or who or where we've been, that ultimately we find the weight and significance of our stories. Maybe it's that our stories are grace stories. And that means that you and I are able to know, in ways that we can never really understand, that our stories, no matter how undeserving, no matter how unknown and unregarded, how unjust and regretful, no matter how unextraordinary, somehow our stories are caught up into the bigger story of God and his purposes. Which is why the list ends like this. Eleazar was the father of Matan, and Matan the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. You see, none of the names in this list has any significance if it isn't for the very last name on the list. It doesn't matter if you're a king or if you're a patriarch or if you founded 3 monotheistic religions or monotheism itself if you're Abraham. It doesn't matter. Your story has no significance. It is ultimately unregarded and unextraordinary and unworthy to be included until Christmas. Until Christmas. Jesus is the axis on which all of our stories turn. Jesus is the beginning of our stories. And whether you know him or not, he's the culmination of your story. And he's the plot line that is weaved into everything in between the big stuff and the little stuff of your life. As we sing one final carol, let me read you this last quote. If so much powerful stuff can have been accomplished down through the millennia by wastrels, betrayers, and outcasts, and through people who were such complex mixtures of sinner and saint, and through so many obscure and undistinguished others, isn't that a pretty hopeful testament to the likelihood that God is using us with our individual flaws and gifts in all manner of peculiar and unexpected ways? Isn't it possible that God is actually using us?